The Omega spoke in sign language to the ignored mute son, and the Alpha King watched closely. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to Elena Harper. The Great Hall of Blackwood Keep glowed beneath chandeliers cut like frozen stars, their light spilling across polished stone and long banquet tables where voices rose and fell in practiced confidence. Yet for all the elegance, a quiet corner remained untouched by attention, a space where a small boy sat with his hands folded and his gaze fixed on the floor, as if hoping the world might pass him by. And this was the first thing Elena noticed as she entered with a tray balanced against her palm. The subtle weight of porcelain familiar to her wrists from years of being useful without being seen. Because Elena Harper was an Omega, and Omegas learned early how to move through rooms without disturbing the air, how to soften their steps and lower their eyes, how to exist without asking to be acknowledged. She felt the hum of the gathering like a low tide around her, measured in glances that slid past and conversations that never paused, and she knew the rules well enough to keep her shoulders relaxed and her expression calm. Yet something tugged at her attention again, a stillness that did not belong among silk sleeves and confident laughter, a child's stillness, patient and practiced, the kind that grows from learning not to expect answers when you reach for them. The boy's hair was dark like his father's, his posture careful, and though he was dressed in fine fabric, he seemed wrapped instead in an invisible quiet that set him apart from the noise. And when a noblewoman leaned down to speak too quickly, and then turned away with a polite smile that never reached her eyes, Elena understood, not with words but with the simple recognition of someone who had been passed over before. She set her tray down where it belonged and continued her work, yet her gaze returned again and again, drawn by the way the boy's fingers traced shapes against his knee, as if practicing a language no one else bothered to learn. And in the far distance, unseen by most, King Rowan Blackwood stood among his council, his presence steady as a mountain, listening more than he spoke, his eyes scanning the room with a patience born of responsibility, until they paused, not on the loudest voice or the boldest smile, but on the small exchange unfolding at the edge of the light where an Omega slowed her steps and looked at his son with a gentleness that required no permission. Elena did not know she was being watched as closely as she watched the boy, nor did she know that the choices she made in the next moments would matter. Only that kindness, when offered quietly, had a way of finding its mark, and as the hall breathed and the evening settled into its rhythm, something subtle shifted, like the first change in the weather before a storm, unnoticed by many, but impossible to ignore once felt. Elena felt the shift before she understood it, a subtle tightening in the air that brushed the back of her neck as she moved along the edge of the hall, collecting empty cups and offering quiet nods where words were unnecessary. And though she kept her eyes lowered as etiquette demanded, she could feel the boy watching her now, his attention light but steady, like someone testing whether a door might finally open if he pushed just a little. And when she glanced back, careful and brief, she saw his fingers pause mid-motion, uncertainty written in the small space between his brows. And in that moment, memory rose unbidden, of classrooms where voices spoke too fast, of hands that waved her aside when she tried to explain herself, of learning that silence could be safer than interruption. And so she did not hurry him, did not smile too brightly or lean too close, but instead slowed her steps and lowered herself to a respectful distance, the way one approaches a shy animal or a fragile thought. The boy lifted his hands again, shaping a careful sign, incomplete, hopeful, and Elena answered without thinking, her own fingers moving with the ease of long practice, her expression open and calm, not performing, not correcting, simply responding. And the effect was immediate, his shoulders loosening as if a weight had slipped free, his eyes widening with a quiet wonder that said, "Someone sees me, someone understands," and the hall continued around them, unaware, conversations overlapping and chairs shifting, until a pause rippled outward, small at first, then widening as a few nearby guests noticed the unusual stillness between the Omega and the child. Elena remained focused, asking a simple question with her hands. "How are you?" And when he replied, carefully and slowly, she nodded, acknowledging the effort as much as the meaning, and he smiled, a quick bright thing that vanished as soon as it appeared, as if he feared it might be taken away. From the far end of the room, King Rowan Blackwood watched without interruption, his posture unchanged, his gaze sharp but thoughtful, noting the way his son leaned forward, the way Elena mirrored his movements rather than guiding them, and something in the king's expression softened, a subtle easing that only those who knew him well would recognize. The boy gestured again, this time more confidently, telling her about the music that felt too loud and the room that felt too big, and Elena answered with patience, validating each concern with a nod or a gentle sign, offering reassurance without promise, presence without expectation, and when she asked his name, he spelled it carefully, pride flickering as she repeated it back perfectly, "Noah," and the soundless exchange drew a small circle of quiet around them, a pocket of calm amid the grandeur. A server passed and hesitated, uncertain whether to interrupt, and Elena lifted one finger in a polite signal to wait, her attention never leaving Noah, who laughed silently at the small assertion, a shared secret that made his chest lift with a deeper breath. The king noticed that too, the laughter without sound, the way it changed the set of his son's shoulders, and he felt a familiar ache, the kind that came from realizing how much had been missed in the name of duty, and though he did not move, his presence sharpened, intent gathering like a held note. As Elena finished the conversation with a simple sign for thank you and a promise made only with her eyes, that she would remember, Noah reached out, hesitant, then placed his small hand over hers, a gesture of trust that stilled the nearest voices completely, and Elena accepted it without surprise, steady and warm, and somewhere between the chandeliers and the stone walls, a line was crossed, not loudly, not ceremonially, but with the quiet certainty of something true finding its place. The moment did not linger as moments often do in stories. It folded itself quietly back into the evening, leaving only a trace behind, a sense of something having settled into place, and Elena withdrew her hand with the same calm respect she had offered it, giving Noah space without retreating entirely, a balance she had learned through years of listening more than she spoke, and as she rose, she felt the awareness of the room sharpen, not hostile, not warm, but curious, the way people notice a candle only after it has been lit for a while. Noah remained where he was, straighter now, his hands resting easily in his lap instead of twisting together, and when a distant laugh rang out too loudly, he did not flinch, instead glancing toward Elena as if to confirm that the world had not suddenly turned against him, and she gave a small nod, grounding him without drawing attention. King Rowan Blackwood finally moved then, not toward them, but closer, adjusting his position among the gathered guests so that his view was no longer distant, and those who noticed shifted instinctively, creating a subtle path that required no command, because the Alpha King did not need to raise his voice to be obeyed. Elena sensed the change like a shadow passing over sunlight, yet she kept her posture steady, continuing her work with the same careful motions, though her awareness sharpened, attuned to the weight of being observed, and when she looked up, their eyes met for the first time, not long, not challengingly, but enough for recognition to spark, and in that instant she saw not judgment, but assessment layered with something quieter, something human. Rowan's gaze flicked to his son, noting the difference a few minutes had made, the color in his cheeks, the way his foot tapped not with anxiety but rhythm, and the king's chest tightened with a familiar mixture of relief and regret, because he had built a kingdom brick by brick, law by law. Yet here was proof that one gentle conversation could shape a heart more surely than any decree. A court official approached Noah, intending courtesy, but hesitated, uncertain how to address him, and before the silence could grow awkward, Elena intervened with a respectful inclination of her head and a few graceful signs, bridging the gap with practiced ease, and Noah responded, his movements more confident now, clearer, as if the language itself had become lighter in his hands. The official blinked, then smiled, genuine this time, and followed Elena's lead, and a few nearby guests watched with renewed interest, seeing not deficiency, but connection, and the ripple spread, small but undeniable. Rowan observed all of it, The Omega's instinctive leadership, the way she elevated others without claiming space for herself. And he wondered, briefly, how many like her had passed through his halls unnoticed, and what that oversight said about the cost of rule. Elena felt the evening drawing on, responsibilities calling her elsewhere, and she knelt once more before Noah, asking with a glance if he would be all right. And when he nodded, then hesitated, then signed thank you with careful emphasis, she answered in kind, pride warming her expression. And as she turned away, Noah did something unexpected. He stood, small but determined, and followed her a few steps before stopping, looking back toward his father, then back to her, uncertainty flickering. Again, Rowan did not speak, but he inclined his head, just slightly, granting permission without words, and Noah took another step, reaching out to catch Elena's sleeve, not to hold her, just to anchor himself, and she paused, acknowledging him with a smile that said you are not alone. And in that quiet exchange, witnessed by the Alpha King and a growing number of attentive eyes, the unspoken hierarchy of the hall shifted, making room for something softer, something enduring, and Rowan Blackwood knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that the night had already changed the course of more than one life. The hall gradually returned to its rhythm, though it never quite recovered the careless ease it had carried before, and Elena felt that difference as she moved farther from the central tables, the soft murmur of conversation trailing her like an echo that refused to fade, because eyes followed now, not openly, not rudely, but with a new awareness that made her steps feel heavier, and she reminded herself to breathe, to remain exactly who she had been an hour earlier, an Omega doing her work with quiet care. Noah returned to his seat beside his father's place, yet he no longer folded into himself, his hands resting loosely as if ready to speak again at any moment. And when someone nearby glanced his way, he did not look down, but instead met their gaze with calm curiosity, a change so subtle it might have been missed by anyone not watching closely, though King Rowan noticed every detail. The way his son's attention drifted toward the paths Elena took through the room, tracking her with the simple trust of someone who had found an anchor. Rowan remained where he was, answering questions, acknowledging guests. Yet part of his focus stayed fixed on the quiet exchange unfolding at the edges of the gathering, and he found himself thinking about language, about how power often relied on the spoken word, proclamations, oaths, commands, while true understanding sometimes arrived without sound, carried instead through patience and presence. Elena paused near a side table to set down a tray, and there she encountered a few hushed voices, curiosity edged with caution, questions formed but not quite asked, and she met them with a polite smile that offered nothing beyond courtesy, because she had learned long ago that explanation was rarely owed, especially when kindness had been given freely. A younger attendant approached her then, wide-eyed and uncertain, attempting an awkward gesture with their hands, clearly imitating what they had seen, and Elena responded gently, correcting the movement with care, encouraging rather than dismissing, and the small interaction sent another ripple through the room, the idea taking root that perhaps this silent language was not something to fear or avoid, but something that could be learned. And Noah watched that too, his chest lifting with a pride that surprised even him. Rowan noticed the way his son's gaze brightened, and a thought settled firmly in his mind, that the future he was shaping could not be built solely on strength or tradition, but on the ability to listen in every sense of the word. As the evening drew closer to its end, Rowan made a decision that surprised no one and everyone at once, signaling for the gathering to ease into smaller conversations, releasing the formal structure without announcement, and guests moved accordingly, sensing the shift as they always did, and in that easing, space opened, not just physically, but emotionally, allowing quieter moments to surface. Noah rose again, this time with less hesitation, and crossed the short distance to Elena, stopping just beside her, his presence gentle but certain, and she turned to him immediately, lowering herself to his height, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and they spoke again with their hands, brief and warm, sharing observations about the room, the lights, the way the music felt softer now, and when Noah signed a question, asking if she would return another day, Elena answered, honestly, that she hoped so, and that was enough. Rowan stepped closer then, not looming, not commanding, simply present, and when Elena looked up, She found him watching with a thoughtful calm that held no accusation, only curiosity, and he addressed her carefully, choosing his words with the same deliberation she had shown his son, thanking her, not as a king to a subject, but as a father recognizing care given freely, and Elena inclined her head, accepting without shrinking, without expanding herself beyond what she was, and in that balanced exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual understanding that what had begun in quiet would not end there. Noah reached for his father's hand, then for Elena's, linking them briefly in a small circle of shared presence. And though no one spoke, the meaning was clear, that this was not a passing kindness, but the beginning of a change that would move outward from this moment, carried not by force, but by example. And as the chandeliers dimmed and the hall settled into evening's close, Rowan Blackwood understood that the strongest bonds were not always forged through ceremony or law, but through the simple act of seeing another person fully and choosing to meet them where they stood. The gathering finally dissolved into softer currents of movement, guests departing in small clusters as the night settled beyond the tall windows, and Elena felt the familiar easing that came when her duties shifted from public visibility back toward quiet completion. Yet something remained different, a subtle awareness that followed her as she returned borrowed items and straightened spaces no one would notice until morning. Noah stayed close to his father now, but he no longer clung, instead standing with a relaxed confidence that seemed to surprise even him, and every so often he glanced toward Elena with an unspoken question that she answered with a reassuring nod, letting him know that connection did not vanish simply because distance returned. Rowan watched this exchange with careful attention, noting how easily trust had formed and how naturally his son accepted its presence, and he found himself considering how much effort had been spent searching for solutions in the wrong places, overlooking the simple truth that understanding often arrived through patience rather than strategy. As the hall emptied, Rowan dismissed the remaining attendants with a gesture, choosing quiet over ceremony, and when the doors finally closed, the vast space seemed to breathe, shadows softening the stone and the chandeliers dimming to a gentle glow. Elena gathered the last of her tasks, preparing to withdraw as she always did, yet Rowan's voice stopped her, calm and unhurried, asking her to remain for a moment. And though her instinct urged caution, she turned and met his gaze without fear, grounding herself in the same steady presence she had offered Noah. Rowan thanked her again, more personally this time, acknowledging not only her kindness but her skill, the way she had bridged a gap without drawing attention to it. And Elena responded honestly, explaining that she had learned long ago that communication took many forms and that everyone deserved to be met where they stood. Noah watched closely, following the exchange with bright focus, and when Rowan asked Elena how she had learned such fluency, she shared pieces of her past without embellishment, speaking of teachers who had taken time and communities that had taught her that listening was an action, not a passive state. Rowan absorbed every word, recognizing in her story echoes of his own son's experience, and a decision took shape, not impulsive, but deliberate, rooted in the understanding that the environment he created would shape Noah's future as surely as any law. He asked Elena if she would consider returning, not as an attendant bound by duty, but as someone who could help ensure that Noah never again felt invisible within his own home, and though the request carried weight, it was offered without pressure, leaving space for her choice. Elena felt the magnitude of the moment settle around her, yet she did not rush her answer, instead looking to Noah, who met her gaze with quiet hope, and she realized that the path opening before her was not one of elevation or reward, but of purpose, and that was what mattered. She agreed, carefully, setting boundaries that honored both her role and her independence, and Rowan accepted them without challenge, his respect evident in the ease with which he adapted, and in that exchange, trust deepened. Noah stepped forward then, signing with growing confidence, asking when she would return, and Elena answered with a smile and a promise of soon, sealing it with a gentle gesture that made his face light up in unmistakable joy. As they parted for the night, the bond formed did not demand attention or announcement. It simply existed, steady and sure, and Rowan watched Elena leave with a thoughtful expression, understanding that true strength was often revealed not in dominance or command, but in the willingness to learn and to change. The keep settled into quiet, yet something had awakened within its walls, a shift in how voices would be heard and valued. And as Rowan guided his son toward rest, he knew that the future had begun to turn, guided by a language spoken without sound and a kindness offered without expectation. Morning arrived quietly at Blackwood Keep, pale light slipping through tall windows and settling across stone floors as the household shifted from sleep to routine, and Elena entered through a side corridor she had been guided to the night before, her steps measured, her presence unannounced, exactly as she preferred, yet the guards nodded with a new awareness that told her role had already been acknowledged. She was led to a smaller sitting room adjoining the main hall, a space softened by rugs and low shelves, where Noah waited with careful anticipation, his hands resting together as if he were holding onto a thought, and when he saw her, his face brightened with unmistakable relief, a smile spreading slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. Elena returned the smile and greeted him with a familiar sign, asking how he had slept, and his response came quickly, fluid and confident, a story told through gesture about dreams and morning light, and the sound of birds he could feel through vibration more than hearing. And she listened fully, offering attention without correction, encouraging him to finish every thought. Rowan observed from the doorway, silent, noting how easily the room filled with calm when Elena was present, how Noah's movements grew expressive and assured, and he realized that what she brought was not simply skill, but permission for his son to exist without apology. As the morning continued, Elena guided Noah through simple activities, shared observations about the world beyond the windows, and introduced signs for new words, always at his pace, never pushing, and Noah absorbed each lesson eagerly, his confidence building with every successful exchange. Rowan joined them at intervals, learning alongside his son, his large hands moving carefully as he practiced the signs Elena demonstrated, accepting correction without frustration, and in those moments, father and son met on equal ground, both learning a language that asked them to slow down and truly see one another. The keep adjusted around this quiet shift, servants pausing to observe, guards softening their stances, a subtle transformation taking root as people recognized that leadership was being expressed not through command, but through example. Elena felt the weight of the change, yet she did not seek it, focusing instead on Noah, who now moved freely through the space, exploring shelves, pointing out details, asking questions with his hands, and each response she gave seemed to strengthen something within him that had long been held back. Rowan watched his son laugh silently at a shared joke, his shoulders relaxed, his posture open, and a sense of gratitude settled deep within him, tempered by resolve, because he understood that this could not be a temporary kindness, it had to become a standard. He spoke with Elena later that morning, discussing ways to integrate this new form of communication into daily life at the keep, ensuring that Noah would never again be isolated by silence. And Elena offered thoughtful suggestions, practical and considerate, always mindful of Noah's comfort and autonomy. The conversation was collaborative, respectful, a meeting of equals shaped by shared purpose rather than rank, and Rowan recognized that this partnership would require trust on both sides, a willingness to listen and adapt. As the day progressed, Noah stayed close to Elena, not out of dependence, but choice, and when she prepared to leave for the afternoon, he signed a question filled with careful concern, asking if she would return tomorrow, and she answered with certainty, promising that she would, that she was not going anywhere. Rowan witnessed the exchange and felt a quiet certainty take hold, that this was not merely a solution to a problem, but the beginning of a bond that would shape his family and his rule in ways he could not yet fully measure. And as Elena departed, the keep seemed warmer, not because of light or fire, but because something essential had finally been understood, that strength did not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived softly, stayed patiently, and changed everything simply by being present. Days settled into a gentle rhythm at Blackwood Keep, each morning bringing a quiet anticipation that Elena felt as she passed through familiar corridors, her presence now expected rather than questioned, and Noah greeted her each time with growing ease, his hands lifting in confident signs that told her of new observations, small triumphs, and moments when he felt seen even in crowded rooms. The keep itself seemed to listen, its routines subtly reshaped as more staff learned simple signs, their efforts imperfect but sincere, and Noah responded with patience that mirrored Elena's own, his world expanding with every person who tried. Rowan watched these changes unfold with measured satisfaction, recognizing that leadership was not diminished by adaptation, but strengthened, and he began to introduce Elena to others not as an attendant, but as someone whose insight mattered, whose presence carried quiet authority. One afternoon, as light filtered through high windows and settled in soft patterns across the floor, Rowan invited Elena and Noah to join him in a smaller council room, not for formality, but for inclusion, and Noah took his place without hesitation, his posture relaxed, his hands ready to speak when words were too slow. Elena noticed the way Rowan adjusted his pace, waiting for signs to be exchanged, ensuring that his son was part of every thought, and she felt a quiet pride that this space had been reshaped through understanding rather than force. As discussions unfolded, Noah followed attentively, occasionally asking questions with careful gestures, and when Rowan paused to answer, he did so fully, never rushing, never simplifying beyond respect, and the exchange transformed what might have been an ordinary meeting into something richer, something whole. Elena sensed the significance of the moment, understanding that Noah was learning not just language, but confidence, seeing himself reflected in his father's attention, and she knew that this foundation would shape him long after her role evolved. Later, as they walked through the gardens, Noah signed about the flowers and the patterns of light, his curiosity boundless, and Elena responded with shared observations, guiding without leading, allowing his interests to direct the moment. Rowan followed a few steps behind, giving space while remaining present, and he felt the quiet certainty that this balance, closeness without control, was what his son needed most. When Noah signed a question that surprised even him, asking why some people did not want to learn his language, Elena answered honestly, acknowledging fear and unfamiliarity without judgment, and she reminded him that change often began with one person choosing to try, and Noah considered this carefully, nodding as if accepting a responsibility rather than a burden. Rowan listened to this exchange with thoughtful intensity, recognizing that his son was developing not only communication, but empathy, a trait that would serve him far beyond the walls of the keep. As evening approached, Noah grew tired, his movements slower, and Rowan lifted him gently, carrying him toward rest while Elena watched, her heart steady with the knowledge that she had been allowed to witness something deeply personal, a bond strengthening through shared effort. Before they parted for the night, Noah reached out once more, signing a simple phrase that carried more meaning than its simplicity suggested, "Stay," and Elena answered with reassurance, reminding him that she would return, that this was not an ending, but a continuation. Rowan met her gaze then, gratitude and resolve clear in his expression, and in that silent understanding, Elena recognized that her place here was no longer defined by circumstance, but by choice, mutual and deliberate. As she departed, the keep settled into evening calm, and Rowan stood at the window watching the fading light, aware that the changes taking root were not temporary, but lasting, shaped by a language that had given his son a voice and reminded him that true strength was found in listening, adapting, and allowing gentleness to lead. The change did not arrive with ceremony. It revealed itself in quiet moments that accumulated until they could no longer be dismissed, and Elena sensed it one afternoon when Rowan asked her to remain after Noah had gone to rest, his request framed not as an order but an invitation, and they sat across from one another in a room warmed by late sunlight, the space between them defined by mutual respect rather than rank. Rowan spoke thoughtfully, reflecting on the weeks that had passed, on the way the keep had adapted, on how Noah now moved through his own home with confidence, and he acknowledged openly that none of this would have happened without Elena's presence, without her willingness to meet silence with patience instead of pity. Elena listened, hands folded, understanding that this conversation carried weight, yet she did not interrupt, allowing Rowan the space to name what he was still learning to articulate, that leadership required humility as much as strength. He admitted that he had once believed providing protection and structure would be enough, but that watching his son find his voice through another form of language had reshaped his understanding of what it meant to truly see someone. And as he spoke, Elena recognized the vulnerability beneath his measured tone, the courage it took for a king to acknowledge change. When Rowan asked how she saw her place within this evolving world, Elena answered honestly, explaining that she had never sought influence, only connection, and that her greatest hope was that Noah would grow knowing his worth was not defined by how closely he matched others, but by who he already was. Rowan absorbed this with quiet intensity, and in that moment, something settled between them, an understanding that extended beyond roles and responsibilities, grounded instead in shared purpose. Later that day, Rowan invited a small gathering of trusted members of the household, not for announcement, but for demonstration, and Elena stood beside Noah as he communicated confidently, guiding others through simple signs with her encouragement, and the effect was unmistakable, curiosity replacing discomfort, engagement replacing distance. Rowan watched the room respond, seeing how quickly barriers fell when given the right tools, and he realized that this shift was not confined to his family. It had the potential to reshape his entire domain. When the gathering ended, Noah lingered with Elena, signing excitedly about teaching others, about how it felt to be understood without having to fight for attention, and Elena shared his enthusiasm, reminding him that patience would be needed, that not everyone learned at the same pace, and Noah nodded thoughtfully, already grasping the balance between hope and realism. Rowan joined them then, kneeling to meet his son at eye level, and signed a simple phrase that Elena had taught him, one that conveyed pride without words. And Noah's face lit up, the bond between them visibly strengthened by this shared effort. As evening settled, Elena prepared to leave. Yet Rowan stopped her once more, this time acknowledging not only her contribution to Noah's life, but the way she had challenged him to grow, to listen differently, and he expressed his intention to ensure that what they had begun would continue, woven into the very fabric of the keep. Elena accepted this with grace, aware that recognition did not change who she was, but it did affirm the value of what she offered, and as she departed into the fading light, she felt a sense of balance, knowing that she had been part of something meaningful without losing herself to it. Inside the keep, Rowan watched Noah settle into rest with a calm he had rarely known before, and he understood that this was not a temporary chapter, but a turning point, one that had revealed a different kind of strength, one rooted in attentiveness, respect, and the quiet power of being truly seen. The season turned quietly, leaves shifting color beyond the windows as Blackwood Keep settled into a steadier rhythm, and Elena felt the culmination of weeks in the way mornings began with purpose rather than uncertainty. With Noah greeting the day confidently, his hands ready to speak, his presence assured. On a clear afternoon, Rowan invited Elena and Noah to the upper terrace where the view opened across the valley, a place reserved for reflection rather than ceremony, and there he stood with his son beside him, allowing silence to rest comfortably between them. Noah watched the horizon, then signed thoughtfully about how the world seemed larger now, not louder, just more open, and Elena responded with affirmation, reminding him that his voice had always been there, waiting for the space to be made. Rowan listened, absorbing the truth of it, and for the first time he understood that authority did not require the center of attention, it required creating room for others to stand fully. He addressed Elena then, not with formality, but with clarity, acknowledging that what she had brought into his home had reshaped it, that her patience had become a foundation upon which trust now rested, and he expressed his intention to ensure that this way of listening would extend beyond his walls, into the halls where decisions were made, and futures shaped. Elena accepted his words with calm humility, emphasizing that change endured best when shared, when many hands learned the same language of respect, and Rowan nodded, already envisioning a future where silence was not mistaken for absence. Noah stepped closer to Elena, his movements unguarded, and signed a question that carried the weight of choice, asking if she would remain part of his life even as things grew and changed, and Elena answered with warmth, promising constancy without possession, presence without constraint. Rowan watched this exchange and felt a deep certainty settle, understanding that bonds formed through trust did not require grand declarations. They held because they were chosen again and again. As dusk approached, the terrace filled with soft light, and Noah signed a final thought, simple and sincere, that he felt safe, and the words landed gently, profoundly, in the quiet space between them. Rowan placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, meeting Elena's gaze with gratitude that needed no embellishment, and in that moment, the future seemed less like a burden and more like a shared path. When Elena prepared to leave, Noah walked with her to the corridor, pausing where they had first spoken with their hands, and he signed a careful farewell that carried hope rather than fear, and Elena returned it with reassurance that tomorrow would come, and she would meet it with him. Rowan watched her depart, noting how naturally she moved through the keep now, not as someone passing through, but as someone who belonged by virtue of trust earned, and he understood that belonging was not granted by title or decree, but by the quiet consistency of care. That night, as the keep settled and stars emerged beyond the windows, Rowan reflected on the change that had begun with a single moment of attention, a single choice to observe rather than interrupt, and he recognized that leadership, at its best, learned from gentleness without losing strength. In the days that followed, the signs learned would spread, the patience practiced would deepen, and Noah would grow knowing that his voice mattered, that his presence shaped the world around him, and Elena would continue forward, grounded in the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful transformation began not with command, but with listening closely and choosing to respond.